I've had the most fun getting all of you all together and getting to know on the telephone Bonnie, whom I did not know, and then all of the rest of you whom I haven't seen in forever. It's been so much fun trying to get us all together. And I think the way that we want to start is starting with Bonnie and then to Gertrude. And do you all know how you came in the flow of things? And tell a little bit about yourselves, introduce yourself and who you work for. And then I'm told we're just going to sit around and talk like we were sitting around drinking iced tea and eating, cucumber sandwiches or something. So we'll sit around and do that then for a little while. So Bonnie, if you would like to start.
Well, I'm Bonnie Holmes, and I work for 3 center directors, Dr. Werner von Braun, Dr. Eberhard Reese, and Dr. Rocco Catrone. I was working with Dr. von Braun in the Guided Missile Development Division, Department of Army, before we became NASA. So I worked for him for 18 years until he went to Washington. And then Dr. Reese was his successor, so I worked with Dr. Reese until he retired. And then Dr. Catrone came during the Skylab days, and I was his secretary until he went back to the Cape. So I was born over at Lacey Springs, and I was working in Columbus, Georgia, when I decided to apply to come to Huntsville. And that was the greatest decision I ever made.
So you were a charter member of NASA.
Of NASA, yes.
Yeah. Wonderful.
I'm Gertrude Kennard, and I worked for Dr. William R. Lucas many, many years. I started working for the Army in civil service in 1954, and I worked when the line was still in operation. If you remember that they had ammunition out there, and I worked in an ammunition area, and I came from there to Marshall and was interviewed by Kingsbury, and Kingsbury was filling in for Dr. Lucas that day, and he hired me. And I didn't know whether I really had a job or whether he was going to, accept me when he came back off of leave or not. But anyway, he did, and I worked for him for many years. And we started over at the structures and development laboratory later, but we were in materials first, and we went through the gamut, and he came all the way up to director finally, and I came along with him all the way. So I could tell you each step that we took as we came up the ladder, but it's been exciting.
I'm Evelyn Staples, and I went to the director's office in 1983 as a second secretary in Dr. William R. Lucas's office. I was in the same office with Gertrude for 3 years. And after the Challenger accident and J.R. Thompson returned to Marshall to be the center director, I became his secretary. He didn't actually hire me, he just inherited me. And so I worked there for 3 years until he was appointed Deputy Administrator of NASA, at which time I transferred to NASA headquarters, and I was a secretary to him up there. And I came to Huntsville. I followed my husband, who was transferred with the Apollo program by Boeing. And my time at Marshall was primarily in the space lab. Is that right? Program office in the Science and Engineering Directorate. And it's been a great ride for somebody that learned to type on a manual typewriter and was pushed into the computer age. So it's been great.
And I'm Sandra Turner, and I worked for Jack Lee, that was Center Director from 89 until 93. And I worked for him until about the last 18 months of that time. actually began working for him when he was acting manager of the Special Projects Office, where I was working in the front office at that time. He was wearing a second hat. I think at the time he actually was the deputy director to Dr. Lucas. And anyway, this was an additional duty that he was given. This was often the case when they needed someone to fill those shoes when someone had retired. That was my first encounter with him, and later I became his secretary. His secretary was Jackie LeMay at the time, and I consider her one of my mentors. And she moved on and progressed out of the secretarial field, and he selected me to be his secretary, and I was his secretary as deputy director for quite some time. In fact, I guess a total of 8 years I worked for him. And of course, I have many fond memories of working with Gertrude and Evelyn and Beth and Jerry Ann and Joanne. We all work closely together. When you're in that kind of environment, you become very close and share a lot of things, and you bond very much. I didn't come to Huntsville. I was born here. My husband and I both are native Huntsvillians, and it was just sort of a natural thing that when you graduate from high school or college or whatever, you go to work in the space program or the defense program. And at the time, I had graduated from high school here and knew many of Dr. Von Braun and his compatriots' children, went to school with them, and the environment was just such that it was exciting, and that was the thing to do. I actually started to work, as did Bonnie and Gertrude, with the Guided Missile Development Division. And at that time, I worked in one of the labs, the fabrication lab, for a guy named Max Victoro. Later, I decided to leave and go to college for a year in Tuscaloosa. And I departed thinking I might pursue something else. And I returned on a temporary appointment because I had planned to go back. And about that time, I fell in love and got married and decided to stay. And my husband was involved. He worked with ICAL as a young engineer, and Boeing as well. So he was involved somewhat with the Saturn V program when he worked with Boeing. And our lives just were sort of focused around, or not necessarily focused, but very much were impacted by the space program. And you just sort of come to eat, sleep, and breathe it. And I decided I didn't want to pursue anything else. So I stayed there until my first child was born and left to raise the family. And when I got them into high school, I decided I wanted to try to go back and see if there was something I could do with NASA. And I did return. The only thing that was open was a temporary appointment, and that was only because I had already gotten my career conditional appointment. So I hired on as the GS1, and then later got a permanent appointment, and that's when I was working in the Special Projects Office, and then progressed on to be the Center Director's secretary, and I enjoyed every minute of it. I wouldn't take anything for the memories that we all have of those times. We were all part of making history, and it was great.
I'm Joanne DeGroff, and I was secretary to Mr. Lee, Jack Lee, from 1992 to 1994, when he left and went to Washington to be I guess it was an assistant administrator for Mr. Golden, who had become the chief at that time. And I started out at Redstone Arsenal in 1956 working. I grew up in the county, out in Madison County, and we had a shorthand and a typing teacher whose her main goal was to teach all the girls how to get out of the cotton field. So I was raised on a farm, and she made sure she taught us how to type and take shorthand and everything. So I went to work at Redstone as a GS2, excuse me, and then I worked for there for a few years, so I started having my family and I started staying at home. Then I came to work for Marshall Space Flight Center in early 1970s, and I worked 12 years on the shuttle task team. My last boss at shuttle was Jim Odom, and so when he went to head up the Hubble Space Telescope program, he took me along, and we stayed there for a while, and he got that going really good, got it on the right track, and then they moved him up to S&E to take Mr. Kingsbury's place when Mr. Kingsbury retired, and chief of S&E, and I went with him there, and then Mr. Odom was pulled to go to Washington to head up the space station program in Washington. And Dr. Littles was his deputy, and he became the chief of S&E, and I became Dr. Littles' secretary. And then Dr. Littles was selected as the deputy director when Mr. Lee became the director, when Dr. Littles. And I moved down to the deputy director's office with with Dr. Littles. And then when Sandra took her job as in the protocol office, Mr. Lee needed a new secretary, and I was selected to be his new secretary, and I worked for him for 2 years before he went to Washington, and then that was in '94, and it was a good time for me to retire, so that's when I retired. And I feel so lucky to have worked, to have been able to have a job like we had. We were all so lucky.
My name is Jerry Ann Easy. I was born and raised here in Huntsville, Alabama, native like Sandra. The space program has always been there, and it gets in your blood, and you just live it. I started work at ABMA in 1956 out of high school. Like Joanne, I had a teacher that believed in typing in shorthand. Came to work at ABMA, and I worked there for 4 years, and during that time I met my husband. In 1960 we married, and he went to Purdue University to get a master's degree, and I resigned from ABMA, but I had transferred over to NASA in 1960 in August or July, whenever they transferred. I did not, when we came back from Purdue, I didn't go back to work until after my youngest child was 12 years old, so I had about 16 years sabbatical in there. And then when he was in the 6th grade, I went back to work in 1981, and I went to work in the Shuttle Projects Office, External Tank Office. There I worked with Joanne and learned how to do the work all over again. And I went to work as a GS2 back in '56 and came back to work as a GS3 in 1981. I didn't progress much later. I worked in the Shuttle Projects Office in the external tank. Then I worked for Porter Bribble in the shuttle, in the external tank project. I worked for Ron Abraham down in the little office.
Our branch office.
Yes, the branch office. And then when Joanne left, there was another lady that came in, and she stayed for a while, and she moved on to bigger and better things, and then I came in. Irene.
Was originally Porter's secretary.
She was the reason, and then I came in to be Porter's secretary, and then when he moved up to be the manager of shuttle projects, I went with him, and then when he was over in HLLV and all these different places, he started taking me with him because I knew what he liked and the way he wanted it done, and his people that worked for him, all his managers got to the point where they trusted me to slip tidbits of information to him that they wanted him to have. And we had a really good working relationship, and I retired then in 1998. I was quite ill at that time and retired, and it was time to go. So I have had a wonderful life there. I count those days as my glorious days. I laugh and say I had 20 years of growing up, I had 20 years of children, and I had 20 years of work. And really, I think it's been wonderful. Now I'm ready for 20 years of fun.
A different kind of fun to what we had.
A different kind of fun.
Well, I'm Beth Partain, and I am from Hackleburg, Alabama, originally. And I know several of you have heard this story before, but I never ever thought that a little girl from Hackleburg, Alabama would wind up working for NASA. And I mean, I didn't even know what NASA was when I came over for my interview. And Dr. Stuhlinger hired me as the second girl in his office in 1963. Grady Simpson was his secretary. And he would always, for years, the last time I saw Dr. Stuhlinger, would tell the story of he looked up and he saw a personnel lady coming down the hall holding this little girl by her hand and her mother following right along behind her. Well, it wasn't my mother, it was my grandmother. And I know she drove over here from Hackleburg with me for the interview, and for him to know that, she must have come in for the interview, but I don't remember that part of it. But I was very protected when I was growing up in Hackleburg. But started out in the research projects office, and then worked in different offices in research projects, and thoroughly enjoyed every one. Those crazy scientists, they were just a breed unto themselves. And I stayed long enough to get my career appointment, and then I went home and stayed 8 years with 2 babies. I had my son, and he was the main reason I decided I'm going to come back to work, or I was going to just absolutely kill somebody, as much as I love him to this day. But it came back into the shuttle office. Now, I didn't think that I would ever love anybody or any work as much as I loved research projects, but the shuttle people just were wonderful. And I started out in program control and then worked my way up into working for the deputy director of shuttle, first for Ellery May, and he retired, and then Judd Lovinggood. Was in the office with Bob Lindstrom and Marie Gray, and you talk about fine, fine people to learn from. And the stories I could tell about J.R. Thompson and Jim Odom, I won't. But Bob Lindstrom, J.R. Thompson, George Hardy, and Jim Odom, and they were marvelous. From there, I went down to the Cape for 3 or 4 years, and wound up in the Inspector General's office, which was interesting and fun, because I did meet some fine people. But you knew when the phone rang or the door opened, they were coming in to complain about Marshall or about NASA. And of course, I didn't like that at all. So, but then came back to Huntsville, back to Marshall in 1986, the summer after Challenger. And back up to Challenger, I was fortunate enough, while I was down at the Cape, to be one of the hostesses for Dick Smith, who was the center director, and you all know Dick. And I was up on the roof of the LCC when Challenger exploded. And that was, I guess, the worst memory that I have of working with NASA and things that went on after that. Just something you hear and relive all the time. Excuse me.
Where you were.
You just never ever get over it. You always know. I remember I was holding Phil Culbertson. Remember Dr. Culbertson? Sure. His grandson's hand, and was explaining to him in my terms as best I could what was happening. And I saw something different up in the sky. But like everybody else, I don't think it didn't register on us for the longest time. And then I heard somebody in the crowd yell, "Hold it, Scobie, hold it. Hold it, Scobie, hold it." And then there were some family members over on the other side. We were separated by a rope. And I heard a scream come from over there that for months and months, every time I closed my eyes, I would see this explosion in this brilliant blue sky and hear this scream that was just came from their toes. And almost as a body, we had all been told RTLS, return to launch site. And almost as a body, those of us who worked for NASA turned, to look, they were going to come back to the landing site. We just knew they were. Here we knew they weren't, but here we just knew they were going to come. And it fell forever and ever and ever. And they had to hold the family members, or had to let the family members go off the roof first and hold us up there. And there was not a dry eye. There wasn't a sane person on top of that building, I don't think.
And that was the last time they let people.
The last time they let people
view it from the LCC.
From the top roof of the LCC.
Yeah, I viewed it many times up
I
there.
viewed it from there too.
Mhm. It was a wonderful experience, except for the last time that I was up there. But when Mary Bonner called me and said, "Beth, do you want to come back to Marshall?" And I said, "I sure do." So I was driving in for my interview on the ninth floor when it was announced that JR was coming back as center director. And that made me want to come back to Marshall all that much more. So he reported just a few days before I did. He got the place ready for me when I came up. But I worked for Ted Carey on the executive staff, and then he left, and I worked for J.D. Horn. And then Mr. Woody Bethay's secretary, moved to Birmingham, and I was fortunate enough to get to go to work for him. I would not have thought this, and I wouldn't tell this if I had not already told Mr. Bethay this, but Mr. Bethay was the one who kept Bob Lindstrom and Jim Odom and J.R. Thompson and George Hardy from doing what they wanted to do all the time. And and he had a reputation. You're all aware of that.
Responsibility.
And I did not realize the responsibility that man had until I spent 2 years working outside his, in his area, but not for him. And then I went to work for him. The finest man. He has Marshall running in his in his veins. I mean, he just, and I understood why he did the decisions that he made. And he taught me more and gave me more responsibility than anybody. But then Joanne left Dr. Little's to work for Jack Lee. And Mary Cooper again said, would you like to go work for Dr. Little's? Well, I didn't want to leave Mr. Bethay. But she convinced me that was what I needed to do. So I worked for Dr. Little's as deputy until he went to Washington as AA. And then I went to work in transportation. Gosh, this is a long story. But I went to work in transportation for a few months. And then Dr. Little's came back to Marshall as director. And Mary again called. God love Mary. I miss her every single day. But Mary again called and said, would you like to come back to work for Dr. Little's? And I said, you bet your sweet baby. So I was fortunate enough to do that. And then stayed on after he retired to work for Art Stevenson for a couple of years too. So that's my long story about how I got here. But every minute, well, take out the calendars and the telephones.
Talk about the calendars.
Those 24-hour-a-day calendars.
A nightmare.
Every day.
Dr. Van Brandt's calendar.
Oh, I can imagine.
They were.
Yeah, it was
I
changing
can't imagine what it was
constantly.
then. I know what it was like when I was there.
We always tried to get one more appointment in. Every morning when he'd come in and dump his briefcase on my desk, he'd get out all on my desk, everything he'd written to me that to take care of that day. Then we'd talk about calendar. And it was a challenge to keep all of those appointments going. And I had a lot of people that got very irritated at me for going in and interrupting a meeting and said, Dr. Brown, you've got 10 people waiting out here. And they weren't finished with him.
Right.
And, so I got fussed at a few times for breaking up a meeting.
And were you ever accused of not wanting to put somebody in to see the center director?
Yes.
And it wasn't that you didn't want to.
Yes.
You couldn't find.
Are you really trying?
Are you really trying? Well, doesn't he have just 5
Right,
minutes?
so surely, I mean, can you do without lunch and have
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Mr.
or come in
Odom,
earlier to see me?
Mr. Odom had a saying that I thought fit that job so well. He said it's like drinking water from a fire hose.
Absolutely.
It just keeps running.
And that's the way it was. I mean, you know, it was just, everything was coming at you all at one time.
And the changes, of course, when headquarters would call, then the whole calendar.
Everything you read.
Changed for the entire day or the week
Yeah.
or whatever, and you had all these meetings to move.
And it changed everybody else's calendar
Right.
on down the line.
You had all these people you were making unhappy.
And they were holding
You
you
did it
responsible.
personally.
Yeah.
Yeah, often I felt like a dartboard.
Oh, good way to describe it.
People throwing darts at it because they would get so upset about it. They just didn't understand the environment. And if you've never worked in that area, you really have no
Fast
No
days,
idea.
long hours.
We had some
Exactly.
very interesting visitors, though.
Exactly.
out of
very.
town.
Yes.
Yeah, and
That was always.
one in particular that I enjoyed was Lady Bird Johnson.
Really?
She came and visited materials lab when I was down there. And I got the joy, I guess you'd call it, of getting them to clean up the restrooms, you know, and clean up the director's office so that it was presentable, so that she and her assistant, Liz Carpenter, remember her? Mm-hmm. Okay, and they came and they enjoyed the materials lab very much. They toured all over, and I got to serve them cookies and coffee on my good china that I brought from home. And they seemed to enjoy themselves very much. But that was one incident that I really enjoyed. Yeah, and it was a
Yeah,
plus.
she was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And I liked Walt Disney. Were you there when Walt Disney came?
Yes.
I guess the most famous visitor that we had was President Bush.
President Bush.
Yeah, I
First
remember
President
when
Bush.
John
I'm so
Denver.
sorry.
John Denver.
John Denver.
Yeah.
Oh, I remember
Yeah.
John Denver.
John Denver was a very, one of the biggest space fans.
Yes.
I met him first at Cake one day he was down there for a launch.
Well, he came and visited our picnic and brought his son, his adopted son, with him, and that was very interesting and quite a shock.
Yeah, he was a picnic. Is that what you said?
Yes.
And he came to speak to the forum, the Bombard
Right.
Forum.
Yeah.
Several times.
Yeah.
And Gertrude and I had some interesting guests.
Yeah.
Uninvited guests.
Uninvited.
The one who wanted to be a Martian
Martian
astronaut.
astronaut. And she came every day for about 3 weeks, and she would call her son and tell him where she was, and that she was trying to get Dr. Lucas, an interview with Dr. Lucas. That was one I never gave, and that was really a hardship, because it was hard to tell her every day and to look at her book and realize that she wanted to see him, and she really was sincere that she's seen the Martians, and she wanted to tell him about it, and he needed to know it. And this was something that I was telling her, no, I'm sorry, but he's busy and he can't see you. And she never did see him.
Do you all remember the man that showed up and said he was to be the next Senate Director?
I've heard that story, but I don't remember his name.
Leroy Osborne had to be on the elevator.
He was up on the on the front of the 4200.
4200,
Our steps.
steps,
He was trying
yeah.
to come up the steps in his automobile.
He was from the Netherlands, wasn't he? And he was in the conference they were having out at
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right, that's right. That's right.
Civic Center.
But we were-
And it was in the interim. We didn't have a center director. It was before Mr.
That's right.
Thompson came.
That's right.
And he had, when they called him, he came into the lobby, and somebody called Brad, a security.
I think it was Leroy.
And well, he fired Brad.
Did they? Smart guy is the new Leroy.
And he fired 2 or 3 more people, and but I guess they kept him from coming to the 9th floor. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
they
they
did.
did not get.
But they
I think they escorted him right on to
Several
the
did get.
We had several, up there.
Yeah.
though.
Yeah. Well,
The
he
Marshal
they had to
astronaut
escort
was
them.
quite a nice-looking young man from
Yeah.
Nashville. He had a
Yeah.
leather briefcase and,
We had one that worked out there. He used to come in and want to see Dr. Lucas. And he was really having problems mentally. And I finally got hold of his supervisor and found out what the problem was. But he spent many times at my desk and waited to see Lucas. And he never got to see him.
Well, the man from the Netherlands, they called his family, and they found out that he was off his medication. He suffered from delusions of grandeur, they said, and he had gotten off of his medication.
Well, Evelyn, I think you were there with JR, speaking of Leroy again, but a pastor, a female pastor, got up to the 9th floor and pinched him on the butt. Remember that? Leroy on the butt, standing there in the lobby, the elevator lobby. Oh, and it just tore Leroy up. He was just beside himself. Poor Leroy, just got into
there were
Leroy was on the staff.
Well, let me ask you, do you all remember the little button underneath the desk?
Oh,
that you
Lord,
were
yes,
supposed
they
to
just set off
press
so many times.
so many times that you would accidentally touch, and here would come Brad. Is everything okay?
I would be just busy, and I'd look up, and there would be Brad, and I didn't realize.
I'd say, did you have an appointment? Did I miss something?
Oh, he says you rang.
No, I didn't.
It was a little pedal you had.
In case something,
Yeah.
emergency
Yeah,
happened.
Because we had a lot of emergencies and couldn't get hold of them.
Yeah.
Well, they were good. They were always there.
And
a number of times.
There was one time that there was a man, I think he was probably a little deranged or something, and he had worked at NASA, and he was threatening to kill Mr. Buffet and some other people, and they gave us his picture, didn't they?
They did. They passed a picture.
They had a picture that we had to keep on hand, and that was one of the times when Brad, I think I accidentally
hit the
hit the
button.
button. And, he really came up there in a hurry. But
They were good.
I hit that button so many times. It was awful.
But it was
Well, it's fortunate you had a button. We didn't have
absolutely.
it.
And I think that
Deal with it
happened.
personally.
Yeah,
I think that happened
Yeah.
after the Netherlands guy, the new center director, came on board.
I think Brad had.
I think that happened after that to try to keep them up off the 9th floor.
But we had the button.
Yeah, we had a button.
Yeah, I did too.
Yeah,
Of course, you
because-
all preceded me.
Yeah,
so.
because we used it.
But do you all feel like working in these jobs as center directors, secretaries, that you really were able to grow and stretch?
Oh,
And,
yeah.
I think
It was
it's
an
just-
education.
Yeah. I came out
Well,
here
not
at
thoroughly
UAH
enjoyed.
for 2 years, so I went to school while I was doing 10 hours at Marshall for 2 years, and finally the doctor said, you got to give up one or the other.
Right.
I gave
Yeah, that was-
I gave up UAH, but I enjoyed both. I enjoyed both.
I did some of the my classwork here at UAH too, but not while I was
Working.
secretary to the center director. I could not depend on it. That was
It was too
that
much.
was a 24-hour-a-day job.
I love the job. I really
it was,
loved it. But it's something that I
It was
feel
very
like I couldn't have
demanding.
done for
It was
more
a
than 20
very
years.
demanding job, but it was very rewarding.
Oh, it was
Very
great.
rewarding. I think it was the
And,
most rewarding job on the center.
I don't think
I agree
that
with you, Beth.
Jack Lee that I worked for was not a demanding person. He was very demanding of himself, but he was not demanding of other people. But somehow you sensed that demand,
just
you know,
sure.
and
It was
he
just-
set that example by being so dedicated and working 24 hours a day that you just fell right into it. You know, this is what you
Becomes
do.
your life.
That was your life. You're exactly right. Evelyn and I discussed that many times as she would wrap Christmas presents on the way to her home on Christmas Eve in the car.
Exactly right.
Because we had been tied up on Christmas Eve until the 9th hour.
We had the
And,
Christmas parties.
Oh, Evelyn, yes, I was going to say, do you remember that first one that we had? JR?
I
Just
remember
give
it
a
well.
party.
Yeah.
And where's the Christmas tree?
And then how are we going to get food?
Yeah,
Let's
get it all together.
Of course.
Let's
The whole
just,
center.
let's invite the whole center.
So you,
And so now what are you girls going to do about all the food?
I remember he called us in
And
his
there weren't that
office and he
many
said,
of
let's
us
have a
either.
party. And we said, what do you want? And he said, let's have all the works.
all the people. And
All
they
the
came.
people.
And they came.
Everybody
And
came.
they came.
They never
They
stopped.
came
It was
and
a
they sang
wonderful-
carols and ate
It was a
food and
wonderful
And
really
he was
tradition.
Santa Claus.
It was a wonderful
Yeah, he was
tradition.
Santa
Oh, yes, he
Claus.
was.
And he was Santa Claus several years.
Yeah.
I guess every year. Then when we went to NASA headquarters and we had a Christmas party of sorts, they wanted, and I volunteered for him to be Santa Claus. And he had an assistant, a young male assistant, and I went over to the headquarters building to party, and he sat in there, and he had his pipe. At that time, you could smoke, and he set the fur on fire. And he said, "Don't you ever volunteer me to be Santa again." So I never did. But their parties at headquarters were not like Marshall parties.
They weren't as much
They
fun.
left something to be desired.
Well, he started a great tradition.
He did.
Really did.
Yeah, we had a lot of
He
parties.
did.
It was a lot of work for us.
And-
It
Yes,
was-
and
it
we
was.
we carried on after.
We carried on.
And he was glad.
It was a
Yeah.
lot of work, but it was a lot, it was good.
It
It
was.
was
It was
good.
a
It was
good
good.
thing.
It was a good thing.
And then the food that was left over, we would donate it
Donate
to
to
the
the
charity.
Free
Yeah,
or one
yeah.
of the, I can remember being out there on Christmas Eve.
Oh, absolutely.
You know,
Way to
when
get
it was dark and you know, and delivering that
Delivering that
food.
food.
Mhm. But that was a good thing.
Oh, it was
You know,
Yeah.
that
It
was-
served many purposes.
Yeah.
It did, and they were appreciative of it. The directors and managers were all
They
very
really
appreciative
were.
of
They
the
really
effort.
were.
And they finally, in their defense, started taking up money to
Right.
They did.
So we didn't have to do all
to get us to buy the food, so
And
that we didn't have to
That's
make it
right.
all.
We didn't have to
do all
make
the
it all.
decorating.
bring
She
it
did
up.
in charge, and she and Gertrude would dip this fruit in sugar and
Right. Didn't know what we were doing, but we
Oh, did you?
would try anything,
We
right?
read it in a book. We
and
figured
all
it
the
out.
fresh greenery. And
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
you made
crystal
it.
ice.
we have some wonderful pictures.
Yeah.
Have some wonderful memories.
We were fortunate to have those in the days that I was working. But, you know, I mean, everybody was just on the go, 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 go.
And Porter instituted, he smoked. And I don't know how many of the other center directors smoked, but he
We
smoked.
didn't smoke in our office. We had signs.
He did very heavily, but NASA decided, Marshall decided that there would be a no smoking facility.
Yeah.
So he would go out on the front of the 4200, and they had a picnic table out there.
Yeah.
And oftentimes people would drop by,
He'd be there.
knew he would be there,
Yeah.
and he would have unscheduled meetings with people from every agency, from every walk of life on that center. And it was really good. It made a very close bonding. That was a good thing that, you know, he was available, and they knew he would be available at such and such time because he was taking a smoking break, and he'd be sitting under that picnic, be sitting at that picnic under the tree. And oftentimes people would call and they'd say, is he under the tree? Is he ready to go? Is he at the picnic table? And I thought that was really great because it brought in some of the lower, I don't want to say lower class, but the
real worker bees.
The worker bees sit down that would talk to him. And he gained a lot of information from those people.
Porter was a real people person.
person.
That was
Yeah.
that was his real strong
That was
suit.
his very strong point.
He really cared.
Yeah.
He really cared
what
about
was going on. And he
cared,
cared
yeah.
about NASA, and he cared about Marshall.
He really cared.
And he looked for everybody's good points. I've never heard him say a bad thing about anybody.
Yeah. But when we're talking about Challenger, I don't know if everybody feels the same way, but I can't watch that replay now without getting emotional.
Oh, I can't.
Well, I'd like to say something about Challenger because Dr. Lucas was director at that time, and it was the hardest thing in the world on him. I know what he went through day after day after day, and he was not responsible, but he took the responsibility because he felt responsible, and that's when he left. And I don't know whether most people know that or not, but he went through the whole thing, the investigation, and he took it like a person.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yes, it is. I
Strong.
remember that.
Yeah. And he later told me that it was the hardest thing he had ever gone through before. And I know the press laid down on the sidewalk trying to catch him when he would come out of the building to go home. And we would send him out the back door. We moved his car. We did all kinds of things in order to protect him, in order for him to get home and not. And one of the fellows even was being haunted by the press, who was in responsibility position, and he had to climb out his windows in order to get in and out of his house. So it was quite a situation. It was hard on everybody.
It was
hard
very
on everybody.
Everybody felt it.
We worked in the deputy director's office at that time, and of course with Dr. Lucas, the situation, Mr. Lee was acting, well after he left, he was acting until J.R. was selected as Senate director, and the press was really a difficult problem. I mean, the phone literally rang off the wall. And,
Constant.
even though our public affairs people did a good job at keeping them in tow, still occasionally they'd make it up to the office, and it was just a constant problem and concern.
They were all over the floor in 4200.
Yeah.
You could not get through that first floor.
Yeah.
All over.
And we had a role in handling them on the phone,
Yeah.
when they would call in. It was, you had to be alert all the time as to who was calling
And
and
they
who
called
they
from
worked
long
for.
distance, and that was a big problem because you didn't usually know what they were calling about at
Right.
first, and you had to be polite enough to listen.
They could trick you too.
Oh,
They could trick you.
Trick
Oh, yeah,
you,
that's
yes.
right.
I tried.
Yes.
Sometimes they did.
But sometimes they succeed.
The thing, Dr. Lucas never saw any of the press that I know of that he didn't want to see, but it was very difficult.
That was a difficult time for
It was a
all
difficult time for
NASA
everybody.
employees, and especially Marshall employees.
I
We all
think,
took it
I
so
think our
personally.
people rose to the occasion.
I did too.
They
I
did.
did too.
All of them. Dr. Lucas, Mr. Lee, they handled it with class, all of them.
So too.
I worked
We had-
over in the investigation committee. We were secreted away.
Secreted away, yeah.
And I was working on that for the 3 or 4 months that it went on. And I mean, the days were not 8-hour days. I
Yeah.
tell you, they were like 16. And there have been times when I know that there were 24-hour days even on.
Right.
But it was really a sad time. Sad time.
I remember a funny story to go along with that, and it also sort of demonstrates how devoted Mr. Lee was to NASA and whatnot, but it was after Dr. Lucas had left, and J.R. was head of the Challenger investigation team and our board, and Mr. Lee was serving on that board as well, and he was one that wanted to do everything. He didn't want to turn anything down, and you had to make room for it, like we said earlier on the calendars. But he had to go to Washington the day before. JR was calling a meeting at 8 a.m. the next day at the Cape. And it ended up, there was an event that was going into the night, and my task was to get him from D.C. to the Cape for that 8 a.m. morning meeting the next day. And of course, there were no commercial flights available that would get him there at that time of day and night. And the NASA plane had flown them up there for these meetings and whatnot, but you couldn't fly out of National Airport very late at night. I think at 10 o'clock was the latest you could fly out.
Yeah.
So I had to take him out of Andrews Air Force Base. And I think he probably arrived down there, it was probably at least midnight or 1 a.m. in the morning, and flew him into an airfield that didn't keep their lights on at night. I think other things happened there on occasion. So, you know, the plane, the lights were not activated until the planes flew very low.
Right in.
And I remember getting a rental car to be there for him and just praying that it was there when he got off of the plane, because he was by himself. And remind him to be sure and have a quarter in his pocket to make a phone call. But he showed up for JR's meeting the next morning at 8 a.m. They were all very driven and very dedicated to their
Went to the extra.
And Mr. Lee flew his own plane a lot of times too. When
Yeah,
he went
he
on
did,
trips, he would take his own plane.
Yeah.
Fly into
into Titusville.
went to Washington if he went. To Washington.
To Washington.
Flew
I
into
remember when J.R. Thompson used to go back and forth. He used to go back and forth to Washington, to the coast, and he would come in, and he hadn't even gone home because he had just gotten in from a plane ride from Washington. He tried to sleep on the plane, but he came in for the meeting the next day. He was always there.
Yeah, I remember
Constantly.
on one occasion,
Yeah.
Jerry, and I think you may have been on that trip as well, when we had a nighttime launch, and our Mr. Lee's interns were not available to go down there, so he asked me to go support him. And it was obviously a Department of Defense launch, because they were always in the middle of the night. And we worked all day long, got on the NASA plane after hours, and flew down to the Cape for the launch. Of course, it scrubbed in the middle of the night, and we turned around and flew home. I think you were on that trip. And we flew back and got back about 5 a.m., and people were talking about whether they were going home, going to work. And I said, well, what are you going to do, to Mr. Lee? And he says, well, I'm going to work. So I said, okay. So I did run home and change clothes, but he went in and slept on the sofa, I think, in his office until probably got an hour and a half sleep or whatever. And they were just that dedicated. And that's what it took.
And that dedication made our dedication.
Yeah.
It made us want to
We
be
wanted to
more.
do it for them because they were so dedicated.
I remember telling Mr. Lee that I had seen more sunrises since I had been taking the trip than I had seen in my whole life.
And I saw a lot of
And it was
sunsets.
sunrise right out of the window faced east.
Exactly.
And
What
so
you're
you
talking
would see
about.
that sunrise in the morning, in that window there.
Absolutely
Right.
gorgeous.
Yeah.
And then sometimes you could see the sunset when it reflected around the red sky. I'd make Art Stevenson stop lots of times and look up
Yeah.
at it because it was just absolutely so exquisite.
And
Just
Mr.
the
Lee
reflection.
wanted to use Dr. Von Brown's desk
Yes.
when he became
Yeah.
director.
Just ran.
And he used Jen's own desk.
Did he get it?
He did. Yeah.
Yeah, it was still there when Dr. Littles used it.
Somebody's cell phone.
Well, I had to task Joanne of finding a use for that desk. That was when we moved into the director's office after Evelyn and JR left, and they were remodeling the
Is
office.
that what it was?
And he said, the only thing I ask is that I get to have Dr. Von Brown's desk in there in some capacity.
Yeah.
And of course, we had shifted over to more of a period type furniture.
Yeah.
And so I decided to use it as a computer table, a credenza. and the curve in the desk just fit nicely into the corner. And we had a plate made for it.
And
But,
what happened to that? Where is it now?
It's on the 10th floor.
Is it up on the
In the
10th?
corridor outside he went in. I think Axel was the last one.
Axel
He
used to use
that.
that. He did, I think, after our.
Yeah. But
Have you
it's,
ever had to drive home in the snow?
Oh, my goodness. Oh, that was Dr. Little's first duty when he came back from Washington as center director. The first thing he had to do was close the center down for a couple of days because of an ice storm. We always teased him about, closing the center because he was coming.
Dr. Brown had a congressional hearing that he was supposed to attend early the next morning. We were working late. He had been in meetings all day long, and he decided that he was going to change several things in his testimony. Everybody had long since been gone home, and he said, "Bonnie, could you retype this for me before you go home and send it to me?" And he said, "I'll go ahead and have dinner with the family." Well, it was long past dinner time.
Is that JR looking for
It
you?
was snowing outside when I called a driver to come to pick up the testimony to take to him. He said, "Do you realize there's a big snow on the ground?" And he said, "Don't you have a long way to drive?" I said, "We have to drive up the mountain to Eva." And he said, "Oh my goodness." But that was one time I drove home scared because it was snowing. All you could see was the snow. But I worked late a lot of nights, but that one was just one that really frightened me. But I didn't mind working late whenever he needed me. I was there. Sure. You had to be there when you needed to.
They used to kid me about locking up the building because I went home late every night.
I was always late going home. Couldn't carpool because
There was no one
when you were going to go home.
There was no way.
I can remember driving home, and the fog was so thick that
Oh,
I
that's
couldn't see the
happened.
landmarks, and I was starting to get really nervous, because I'm not going to be able to see where the road is and where I'm supposed to turn to go to my house. And I had a car phone at the time, and I called my husband and I said, you may not see me tonight because I don't know where I am. I'm on the highway somewhere. And I said, it was so foggy.
All this strange sounds, but
Well, you all, I don't know, Bob, how long you and Dr. Lundquist, as you can see, we could go on forever and ever. But
One of the things I was going to mention is that we had a little perk there on the 9th floor. We had our own kitchen, and we could with the microwave.
We could fix lunch for our bosses.
Yeah.
that was a real good perk, right.
Well, I did coffee too.
We did it lots of times too.
And supper, we'd fix supper for them.
Dr. Brown ate soup out of the kitchen many days for lunch.
That's about all Dr. Lucas ate.
Dr. Little's went on a diet.
I thought it was
Cabbage soup diet. You remember it, Sam?
I remember how it smelled.
And I'd have to heat it in the kitchen, and you want to know how cabbage smell? Just the whole 9th floor. And Bebe sent in a candle for me to burn. One of those kitchen candles, because she said, I know how it heats up the kitchen, how it smells, because it does at home. So he'd say, Beth, I'm ready for soup. So I'd light the candle and then go put his soup on. That kitchen saved our lives.
Yeah,
Lots of
it
times.
did save a lot. It did.
It did.
You didn't have to leave the floor,
You could eat at your desk if you got a chance.
If you got a chance, you got a chance.
You got big interruptions. Sometimes it takes 2
hours.
2 hours to finish, but you get so many interruptions.
Of course, for a brief while, or maybe not a brief while, you'll remember, Gertrude, we had Bee that would come
Yes,
over.
yeah.
And when Dr. Lucas was director, he held what they call the executive
Staff
luncheons.
luncheon.
And anyway, Bee would come over and bring food from the cafeteria, and she would prepare it in the little kitchen. And if she had time, she would always bring the secretaries a cup of hot tea in the mornings, and that was always very nice. And I remember that, I guess one of the things is we all said the world kind of turned upside down after Challenger, and Dr. Lucas left, and Mr. Lee was acting director, and he said, well, you know, he thought that the executive lunches had proven to be a good thing, but it was time to maybe do something different now. So he decided not to hold those and give people a little bit of time during the day to do errands or whatever. But I remember him asking me how we were going to feel about losing me.
Yeah.
You know, now that means that you all won't have your hot tea or coffee served to you.
She was a love.
Yeah, she really was. But I think every director and every secretary brings something different to the table.
Absolutely.
And so I think we all experience much the same thing, but yet the difference is because of our bosses and their personalities, and then what we ourselves brought to the table. Because I think we probably all handle the job a little bit differently than the other one. Doesn't mean one was better than the other, but we all made it work.
What was going on at NASA at the time.
Yeah.
Exactly, the issues and things that were, and of course, the
Dr.
challenge
Brown would
was.
always bring me notes when he would be on a business trip somewhere. He'd run into somebody, and he would have names and phone numbers scribbled down on napkins, paper napkins, on brown paper sacks, tear off the corner of a file folder and write something. And I would have to keep up with all these notes because he'd say, when I go to Los Angeles next time, I want to make me an appointment with him. But I'd have to keep a particular file of all of these contacts and all these notes that he'd written to me, whether it be in New York or Washington or the West Coast, wherever he was. And when he scheduled a trip, then I'd get out all these little notes and try to work in appointments.
Remember which one this one came
And
from.
sometimes I would have to say, you can meet him. If you meet him at the airport and drive him to where he's going, you can have a conversation with him, a little meeting with him in the car on the way. So I arranged a lot of the trips that way when there just was not enough time to schedule something. If they would pick him up at the airport or have a taxi ready, they could meet in the taxi or something like that. But it was something to keep up with all these little notes that he brought to me.
Didn't have the value of a computer system.
Right.
Yeah, I was pre-computer age.
Right.
We
Yeah.
didn't have
Right.
computers.
Also, you had to keep up with his money, didn't you?
Oh, yeah, I had to keep up with his money.
He'd get somewhere and
never
didn't have
had
any money.
He'd go downstairs to the basement, to get his hair cut. And I would get a call from him and say, you owe me so much, for Dr. Brown's haircut. So I would go down and pay it or send somebody down to pay for his haircut. But I kept it running. I've still got my books. All these expenses. Because now, when it would get near $100, I'd say, Dr. Brown, you have to bring me a check. Because you owe me about
Maybe an issue, a financial problem.
And he just didn't carry money.
You had a hurdle there to try to understand his accent when you first went to work for him, didn't you? I mean,
No, I didn't. Not
You
really.
didn't? You
Not
weren't
face to face. He sounded different in recordings. The accent seemed more prominent in recordings than in talking face to face. I never had a problem with it. And he would not use dictaphone. He hated the dictaphone. So I had to take everything in shorthand. Everything.
Did you meet President Kennedy when he came?
Well, I saw him, of course, but I didn't get to meet him personally. But I talked to his office many times on the phone. And Evelyn Lincoln, his secretary.
She came and
And I
spoke
got her
to
to come
us.
down to speak to the Secretaries Association.
I remember that.
She
You know,
came.
she's deceased now. She's her husband. But
I had
So
an
many times we were,
wonderful
excuse me,
memories.
Gertrude, so many times we were in the background when
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
these
yeah.
people, you would make all the arrangements, and I remember
You knew
working
all
the-
about them,
Right.
but
Well,
you
you know,
didn't get to
President
see them.
Kennedy came twice.
Mhm.
And the last time he came, he wanted Dr. Brown to go with him down to the Cape. So he didn't have a change of clothes. He said, Bonnie, make some arrangements to get me some clean clothes down to the Cape. He said, I'm going with President Kennedy on this plane. These
So you
kind of
did.
things happen
So you
quite
did.
often. I did.
Whatever it took.
That's
It's
right.
what we
Yeah, and
did.
it doesn't, I don't think that they ever asked anything of us that we didn't somehow, some way.
Right.
Work it out.
Fulfill.
Well,
Work it
one
out.
thing was, many of the times they didn't have to ask. We just,
Yeah. We
just
knew
did it. We just knew.
that they needed that, and that's
But we
what you-
also had a lot of help from the interns that we had
Oh,
coming in.
yes, and from one
And
another.
from one another.
Yeah,
Oh, we couldn't
it
have done
was-
it without everybody up there on that night floor.
I think it's a routine, and I'm sure you all did the same thing at night, and it was usually at night. I would walk through the next day. I would literally put myself in his shoes and say, okay, what's he going to need now for this meeting or this meeting or that meeting? How's it going to get from A to B and C to D and so on? You just literally walk through the entire day to think, and if he was on a trip, where is he going to change clothes to go to this event? What does he do with his bags when he gets there? So it's going to be handy when he has to change for this evening event or whatever. You just literally walk through the day and try to anticipate
To
their
anything that
needs.
we could do
And,
to make his day easier.
Right.
is
And I
what we did.
remember Evelyn having to order tuxedos and shoes, remember?
Oh, I remember that.
When it was for an event in Washington, wasn't it? And when JR got there and put it on, he called back and he said, Evelyn, it fits.
Yeah, you have to keep a card with
With their sizes
exactly,
and
everything.
everybody's birthday and the
Oh,
family.
yeah,
and-
yeah.
And remind them, you know, to,
That birthday thing and the anniversary thing.
and the florists.
Yes, and the
Your
florists.
But you didn't mind
Oh,
because
no.
you knew how
Oh,
busy
no.
they were.
No.
And that was what our job was, to free them up to
Right.
concentrate on their business and what they needed to
So they
focus
didn't have to
on.
worry about those
Right.
little
Those little
mundane things.
details
That's
and
right.
how they were going to get
That's right.
places and all of that. And of course, Evelyn had to order JR was not married when he came on board.
Right,
And
right.
she had to look after a lot of those things. And of course, I just picked up the phone, called Gene Lee and said, send Mr. Lee's tux to the cleaners. He's going to need it next week or whatever.
But I don't think today that any clerical person at Marshall or any center would probably ever aspire to be a center director secretary.
I don't
That
think
is
they- I
just
don't
not
think they
something that.
That's an era that's.
That's
Yeah.
right.
It's past.
That's right.
Well, I didn't
And you-
aspire. I mean, you know, I didn't think about
didn't
ever
either.
being.
Well, I didn't either, but I mean, I don't think today that's something that,
I don't think they think about it.
And I don't think if they knew that those demands were there, they wouldn't want
No.
to.
But you know, did you find that they all thought, those who did so much for us down below, and when I say down below, I don't mean that the way it comes across, but
Right.
in the offices, the labs and so forth, if it hadn't been for them, I
Right.
could not have done my job.
Right.
I mean, at
Definitely.
all.
Yeah.
But they seemed to think that all we did was sit up there and do our fingernails and talk
I
about
can-
it.
And I can attest to
Coffee
that,
tea.
working for a contractor, you know. That was a real eye-opener, because I thought, you know, well, who fixes the Xerox? Who puts paper in?
Right.
And who
We were
does
spoiled.
this, you know?
We were spoiled.
And we had to have a security officer, and Mr. Thompson says, if it's between you and me,
Guess who?
Guess who does
Yes,
that?
right. So you become pretty self-sufficient.
I had a different background than most of you. I came from Denver, Colorado, and I grew up in Kentucky. So I didn't really aspire to come here, except that my husband came to get in the Army and work for the Army. And so I was real interested in the technical areas always, because Dr. Lucas was interested in the technical areas. And I'd like to tell you a little story that I remembered. and I don't remember it all the time, so I wrote it down. But it had to do.
That's my trick.
It had to do with Fred Updegraff, if anybody remembered him. And he was an engineer, and when I first came and worked for Dr. Lucas, well, we sneaked out one day, and I don't know how we ever did it, but anyway, Dr. Lucas didn't know that we went over and checked the SA-1 engine test. And I got to go with him, and we were in engineering materials at that time. And that test was so loud. They said Dr. Von Braun used to come over there and listen to it. It would deafen you. In fact, I had to hold my ears in order to even talk or try to talk to him. And after the test, he was so thrilled because he thought it was all, good. And not only did we just listen to the test, I mean in an outside area. There were no bumpers. There were no places to stand. There wasn't even a hole to get in. We just stood there and listened. And then we went up into the vehicle itself and examined it to be sure, while it was still steaming, to be sure that everything went well. And it was so exciting. It was the most exciting experience I think I ever had as I worked for Dr. Lucas, although he made things interesting. But I understood what was going on at Marshall. That was real. That was real. That was every time I went to see a launch, I thought about that because we knew that we tested every single part of the vehicle. And it was so exciting to me to be able to do that on a one-to-one basis. I'll never forget it. I thought it was just worth telling.
We all knew what a perfectionist Dr. Lucas was.
Yeah, he was.
He demanded that of everyone and of himself.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we can credit him for instilling that in all of Marshall. For the success of the Saturn, of the shuttle vehicle.
Yeah.
Because I don't think without that, I was at a party recently where Dr. Littles spoke, and he said he was down somewhere in the organization at the time of the first shuttle launch.
Mm-hmm.
And the edict came down and they had to look at each discrepancy report. And I've forgotten now how many thousands of those there were. And they just thought 30,000. Okay. And they just thought it was an impossible task, but they did it.
They did it.
They did it.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think, that we really owe that to him because he really. And I know when I did his daily journal, it was like I was entering it into a typing contest.
Yeah.
And on an electric typewriter, no computer, But
I can remember just working in the bowels of the organization. Anything you sent to Dr. Lucas' office was going to be gone over with a I can remember typing the weekly notes for the first
how I
time
hated those.
in Special Projects Office that were going forward, and I was so nervous I was just about to lose it, because I knew that either Gertrude or
he was easy to
or Mary or somebody or Dr. Lucas, if they got to him,
If it got to him,
And he
it was really bad. It was really bad.
The margins had to be just
That's
right.
right, and I think he really, but it was that perfection.
But it did
that-
instill that.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. That really is a success of the show.
In fact, I thought I almost lost my job to begin with because when Dr. Lucas had hired me, I offered before he hired me to type something for someone, retype it because it had an error in it. And so I retyped it. And they took it in to him, and he found an error in it. And I could have died. I was ready to go home and just forget it all, And so I got up my energies, and I decided the thing to do was to go in and admit that it was my error. And I called him on the phone, and I said, Dr. Lucas, I typed that, and I made the error, so it's my error. So you put the blame on me. And he said, that's all right. And ever
Because you took
after that,
responsibility.
he seemed to understand that people are normal and that they do make errors and they do have problems. It wasn't mine to type in the first place, and I just offered to do it. But I thought, oh, I've lost my job already.
Before you got started.
Well, do you remember all those times that you had to retype his speeches at the last
Yes,
minute?
yes.
Before he walked out the door?
Yes.
I used to feel for Gertrude.
Change part around too. He would always find something to change.
Yeah. Well, we had pages usually that he changed, he rewrote.
And you had to have that special font in your typewriter.
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
yes.
I remember that special font.
That was the nice part about having the computer.
Oh, yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
Because
Yeah.
you could just go back in the computer and change it.
Except when you lost it.
Exactly.
I know there's lots of things of mine just floating out in this black hole somewhere that I need to get back.
But comparing that to when I first went to work for Redstone Arsenal, and we had manual typewriters, and we had all those
Carbons.
and we
Oh,
had like
yeah.
6 carbons of
Crazy.
everything, and
Yeah.
when you erased, and we had a colonel that he would hold it up to the window to see if you had any original.
And then the finest thing to come along was the whiteout, snow day. If you could just get it in there just right. So
I still use that, don't you?
Took a lot of skill.
It took a lot of skill, yeah.
And I had the first computerized typewriter at Marshall, I got that, in the Skylab Projects office. And it was about the size of this table. Actually, it was about, the console was about the size of this table. Then the typewriter was and it was, and I had it because we did a lot of experiments, and we had all of these experiment proposals. And I would input them, and then I'd run to the restroom. I'd print it out, and it'd be printing out while I was in the restroom. But they rented it from Xerox, and that would have been in about probably 66 or 7. And I think it was like $1,000 a month or something at that time. But it was huge.
Y'all, I know we could keep going forever, but Sandra has a 1:30 that she's got to be back out at the center for. And then we wanted to go all have lunch over at the Bell Center. And you just may have to reschedule us again. Because there's still a lot of stuff I want to say.
Me too. We still have lots of stories.
Some stories when, Sonny Morrell was over the lunar rowing vehicle. And they were having some problems. And I was working for Dr. Reese at that time. He was the center director. And one morning, Dr. Reese came in, dropped his briefcase. He said, "Come here, Bonnie." So I went in. He said, "I'll take this memo to Sonny Morrell." And so I started writing, and he said, and the subject is the lunar roving vehicle, which causes me many sleepless nights. And I said, "You really want me to put all of that in the subject?" He said, "That's the subject." I never will forget that.
He was so cute.
Oh, he was such a...
He was so cute.
He was a lot of fun.
Yeah, he was.
The first dictation I took from Dr. Stuhlinger, Grade Dean, when I came to work, showed up for my work day, Grade Dean was on vacation. And Dr. Stuhlinger was also, but he came back a few days before she did. So he called me in to take dictation. Well, scared to death. Didn't know how to spell dictation. But anyway, it was, let's see, Jackass Flats and in-house and out-house contracts. Well, now in Hackleburg, we didn't say Jackass. So I thought, this can't be right. It's got to be Jackson Flats.
Yeah.
So I changed it to Jackson Flats, and then the out-of-house, I thought, well, okay, if it's in-house, it's got to be out-house, because I was raised with an outhouse, too. So I typed outhouse contract. So he came in, and that dear, sweet man who loved dearly, he was so embarrassed, and he said, "Now, Beth, I know that most of our out-of-house contracts probably belong in the outhouse. But we need to, you need to change that. And he said, and this is Jackass Flats. And I said, surely they didn't name anything Jackass Flats. He said, oh, they did this. They did this. But he was so sweet. He was so good and kind and patient. And that's what I was getting at. Every boss I ever had was so good and kind and patient with me.
We had the cream of the crop.
We did.
We had
We had
managers,
the
and
cream of the crop.
that was, what I always
Well,
feel like
Don
I'm so
Bean had a
lucky.
saying, he says, the cream rises to the top.
And it did. It really did. And I was just fortunate enough to be caught in that ebb and flow of going.
That's a nice way
Right,
to really
the right place at the right time.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
None of the 3 center directors that I worked for ever fussed at me, ever. If I made a mistake, they would calmly point it out.
Very,
And they
very
would
explode
blow,
at you.
blow up, Some people just explode if you put paper on their desk
Yeah.
as a mistake in it. But I rarely did. But
Well, if any of the travel
I never
arrangements ever went wrong, when I was working for Mr. Thompson, he would never, ever complain. Some of those who were on the plane
Heard about
it. Would get me on the phone and let me know everything.
Oh, yes.
There was no rental car.
Oh, yes.
Do y'all remember that the time that it was, I think it was NASA 9, Mr. Odom, Mr. Kingsbury, and it seemed like Don Bean, was Mr. Don Bean on that plane? But anyway, they had a problem.
The landing gear.
The landing
Gear,
gear.
I remember that well. I'm
Yeah.
standing there watching with the
Yeah,
thing out the
I
window.
do, too.
Yeah. And someone, I think,
Dr. Lucas was on one.
I think he was. Yeah.
I think that's when they decided maybe not to have them all go at the same time.
At the same time.
Yeah.
And that was such a good.
Yeah.
Right.
Mr. Odom being such a spiritual person,
Yeah.
somebody made the comment, said, well, just thank the Lord Jim Odom was on that plane with us.
Right.
I'm sure he said several prayers.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure he did too.
He and Lucas both.
Mr. Odom was out of the 4 musketeers of Lidstrom, Odom, Hardy, and Thompson. Mr. Odom was the one who tried his best to keep all the other 3 in line, but there was just no way. And one time in the office, he did say, I don't know, damn, maybe. And bless Mr. Odom's heart, he spent the next 6 months apologizing to me and Marie, for saying that. Of course, we didn't pay any attention to it because we were so used to it. Yeah, he really is a gentleman's gentleman.
Well, I think you always said it. We were very fortunate to have been working for people like we did. I never,
Right.
I never remember a lot of bosses, as you say, if they were taking the heat from somebody, they would come back to the office and take it out on the people that worked for them. But I can truthfully say that Franklin never did that. He just took it in stride and went on.
I never really had a boss that did that.
And I remember another funny thing, Gertrude was talking about Dr. Lucas's being so particular. Mr. Lee had asked me to compose a letter for Dr. Lucas's signature. And I did. It was not a technical thing or anything like that, but, just an administrative type of letter. And I did. And anyway, Dr. Lucas sent it back through him, and with a question mark about I think it was one of the verbs or something, as to whether it should have been plural or singular or whatever that I had used in there. And so he came back and he said, now, I don't want this to ruin your career. But this little circle here, Dr. Lucas disagrees with you on this, and now you can do whatever you think is best.
And you knew what was best,
And I
didn't you?
said, I will do it as he sees it. And of course, he was right. But it was one of those things that was not so clear,
Mr. Lee was really a good boss.
Yeah, he was. Joanne and I
Really, yeah.
have that to share
He was a
with
very
each
good
other.
boss. Very good to work for.
I know Joanne said to me one time that she wished that he would, I think you wanted him to fuss at you, or you weren't sure whether you were pleasing him, and I said, I wish he would just.
Yeah,
Go
that
ahead
was
and-
one thing you didn't get
Right,
any feedback.
right,
from.
yeah.
Like, I always got feedback from like Mr. Odom.
Yeah.
He spoiled me all those years. I always got
Right.
feedback from him, but
No, you
didn't
just
get that
kind of,
feedback
you
from-
just had to
from me.
assume that everything was going well unless.
And I guess, and I think you said, well, if you weren't, you'd hear about it.
Right, yeah. Oh, yeah, I got my hands spanked some, but not, sometimes I deserved it, sometimes I didn't, but.
But you took it.
And I
You
took it, it was never bad, it was always done in a diplomatic manner, you know. And always, when asked to do something, he never told me to do anything. It was, would you do something, or can you do this for me, or do you have time to do? No, I don't have time. You know, it was just, and I've learned a lot from that leadership that's helped me through the rest of my career. That you learn how to get the most out of people, and that it is so much better to ask and treat them with respect and so on.
And I remember when Dr. Lills came, when I was in Hubble, and he would come walking up to the desk, with his pipe in his mouth, strutting down the hall. This is the impression that I had of him. And I remember saying one day, he'd say, "Where's the meeting?" And he was supposed to be going to him, and I would tell him, and then he'd walk away, and I'd say, I wouldn't work for that meeting. For anything.
Me either. I was going to say, I didn't know he smoked
Yeah, when he
pipe.
was in the lab. And then when I went to work for him, I just loved working for him, and I just really, I had a totally different
Oh,
impression
he
of
was-
That was
Totally a
one of the
gentleman.
major complaints that I had from employees about Dr. Littles. Well, he won't speak to me in the hall. He won't speak to me.
Yeah, so he would just walk up to my desk and, was like, "Where's the meeting?" And he didn't address me, but he's really shy, I guess.
Well, he was a very shy person, but he also was very
Shameless,
Right,
focused
yeah.
on where he was going and what he was doing. And so I'd say to these people who would complain about him not speaking, did you speak to him first? Well, no, I wouldn't go speak to him. He wasn't going to speak to me. And I said, but he's thinking, as he's walking down the hall, he's
Yeah,
thinking,
sure, right.
he didn't see you. Well, he looked right at me, and I said, he still didn't see you.
Yeah.
He's got so many things on his mind and would love to talk to you if you would stop him and talk to him.
I remember the time that he testified after Challenger,
He
and that
was
was
the
my
star.
first really positive impression of him. I didn't really know him that well, but I just had thought of him as being quiet and unassuming and maybe on the shy side. But he went before Congress and testified, and I mean,
He
he was
impressed everybody.
cool as a cucumber and did so much for us with that testimony.
Fine man.
He knew how to think on his feet and keep focused on the subject.
Yeah.
He was, I have a lot of respect for
I do too. I do too.
Dr. Littles.
For he and Mr. Buffet. I tell you, two of the finest. Okay, girls, I'm hungry.
Yeah, let's go.
let's go.
Sounds like a good idea.
Bob, thank you so